So, let me welcome you all. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us from wherever you are. My name is Dan Todman. I'm Professor of Modern History at Queen Mary, University of London in the UK. And it's my very great pleasure to welcome you to this seminar. Just probably take a few minutes at the beginning where, people will be joining us at different points. So I'm just going to talk for a little bit, explain how the seminar is going to work, and talk about introduce our speakers, talk about the running order, and then we'll get going. It's a really great pleasure to be asked to chair this seminar discussion about new histories of the Home Front. An amazing panel of speakers coming at this subject from different directions, talking about different countries. And I think one of the most interesting things is going to be to see what we can draw across as cross-cutting themes, but also, I suspect, things that are unique to each of their individual subject areas. So let me introduce those speakers to you. They are, in the order that we're going to be hearing from them, Dr Michelle Moffat, who's going to be talking about her newly published study, Scottish Society in the Second World War, which has a fascinating post-colon subtitle, Tradition, Tension and Transformation. Really like those T's. Professor Wendy Goldman, who's going to be talking about her remarkable award-winning book, Fortress Dark and Stern, The Soviet Home Front During World War II. And Professor Angela Wanhalla, who's going to be talking about her upcoming publication, Te Hau Kāinga, the Māori Home Front. So each of our panelists is going to be speaking for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to have some time for questions and answers and panel discussion at the end. If you've joined us now, you'll be able to see there's a Q&A box. So if you've got any questions at any point, please do type them into the box. We'll gather those, we'll read through them, we'll address them at the end. So after the three panelists have each had a chance to speak, that'll mean that we'll have a good opportunity to group together if people are asking similar questions, to put them into an order, things like that. Okay, so panelists, are you ready to go? Excellent. Then, Michelle, let me hand over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Dan. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody. Let me start by telling you about my research into wartime Scotland. Until now, details of Scotland's experience of the Second World War have remained largely hidden. Previous academic literature on the British Home Front has been relatively London-centric, with little attention paid to Britain's constituent nations. In my recent book, I argue that this is a significant oversight, and that if we are to better understand the complexities and shades of wartime experience, we need to study the diverse nations that comprise Britain. So my book, Scottish Society in the Second World War, uses previously untapped Scottish archives to illuminate Scottish experiences of war. It highlights areas of similarity with wider Britain, but also draws out aspects of social and cultural difference. While archives showed that in some aspects of wartime life, Scottish experiences of war were similar to in other parts of Britain, they also revealed that there were a number of ways in which Scottish experiences differed from those outlined in other studies. Firstly, it was striking that conflict infused many facets of Scottish wartime life. Responses to war were influenced by existing class-based tension, sectarianism, the urban-rural divide, and ethnic discord. I argued that Scotland's history of industrial unrest, radicalism, rising nationalism, and anti-Irish sentiment profoundly shaped local responses to war. But these tensions also shaped official responses, resulting in special measures and campaigns to manage Scottish dissent and discontent, tactics that were possibly unique to Scotland. My second key finding was that in many aspects of wartime society, Scottish actions appeared to be moulded by a tension between resistance and conformity. Before the war, Scottish daily life was characterised by resistance to power and authority, and my research discovered that in almost every aspect of home front life, Scots battled wartime disruption and the increasing influence of the state. Another important theme of my study was that Scottish war experiences were coloured by national and cultural identity. Scottish feelings of distance from London, Westminster, and the war effort may also have reflected feelings of political and cultural distance between Scotland and England. And this was also a period of national and cultural transition as Scotland grappled to re-establish its identity after years of political, economic, and social upheaval. So while wartime rhetoric revolved around community, unity, and civic virtue, Scottish war experiences appeared to be characterised by fracture and tension, and there was limited evidence of feelings of unity with wider Britain, let alone unity within Scotland. In 1939, Scotland was a deeply divided country, and this legacy of fragmentation did not abate upon the outbreak of war. These old divisions continued to widen, and in many cases, wartime disruptions seemed to cause new fissures to appear. So to illustrate these themes, I've selected a case study from my research to tell you about. In March 1942, the Minister of Labour announced that as a result of worker shortages, mobile women, so that was those without caring responsibilities at home, would be directed into employment wherever in Britain that employment was needed. And it was under this scheme that many Scottish and Welsh women were ordered to work in the English Midlands in war production factories. In 1942, when the operation was at its peak, up to 500 Scottish women each month were transferred to England. In Scotland, the issue was one of the most contentious of the war, and it had a noticeable effect on morale. In July 1942, an investigation by the Ministry of Information discovered that many Scottish women sent to the Midlands were struggling to adapt to their new jobs or to fit in with their English colleagues. Some were even overheard saying their lack of choice in the matter made them feel we might as well be under Hitler. A Scottish trades union investigation similarly concluded many of the women felt isolated and unhappy, particularly those in rural billets. In August 1942, a fiery debate ripped through the House of Commons, with numerous Scottish MPs expressing bitter frustration over the transfers. The MP for Dumbarton Boroughs, David Kirkwood, who was a supporter of Scottish Home Rule, demanded that the Minister of Labour issue orders without delay to prevent this transfer of Scottish girls against their will, interfering with war production in Scotland, and to relieve the bitter feeling caused to the girls and their parents. Other MPs described receiving bags of letters from upset mothers and girls, and reported that Scottish employers were simply wild that their needs should be deemed less important than those of English firms. But beneath these concerns also lay anxieties about preserving Scottish nationality and culture. During the debate, Glasgow Gorbals MP George Buchanan stated that while Welsh women were also affected by the policy, it had more of an effect on Scotland as we still have some kind of nationality. Buchanan went on to explain why many in Scotland felt so upset. Today, many of our best women are being picked out and taken away. Scotland is going to be driven into a position similar to that of the distressed areas before the war. As one who has regard for his country, I want to see it preserved. This discussion revealed deeper fears about Scotland and the country's future. Walter Elliott, the former Minister of Health, expressed concerns that such measures might further depress rural areas by removing local skilled labourers. The transfer of women out of Scotland, he said, is a confession of weakness. It is a gospel of despair. There is a grave danger that Scotland will emerge from war not only as a depressed area, but as an area with a potentiality of depression much greater than it has ever had before. Further, nationalist MPs accused the English of denuding Scotland of its womenfolk in a systemic, dastardly fashion. And the Scottish National Party, still in its infancy at that time, passed a motion opposing the policy and reminded members of the legal and moral right of any Scot to refuse to be directed to work in England. The groundswell of discontent at the transfers was expressed from across the social classes and regions of Scotland, demonstrating the extent of public concern over Whitehall's powers to make decisions that were perceived by some as not in the best interests of Scotland. Moreover, it reveals the ways in which the legacies of Scotland's complex relationship with England profoundly shaped Scottish morale. So my book argues that in order to understand Britain during the Second World War, we need to examine experiences in its constituent nations, exploring the similarities and the differences, and seeking to understand cultural distinctiveness and the influence of national identity on wartime experiences. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. What a great, concise presentation, but also one which gave us some real insights into the approaches you've taken in the book, illustrated with just some remarkable photos. I see we've already got one question in. Let's save that till the end. Wendy, you're going to talk to us next. So moving from one home front to another, let's hear about the Soviet home front during World War II.
Okay, well, my talk today is based on my book with Donald Filzer, Fortress Dark and Stern. And the book was also just recently translated into Russian. So we can see the Russian edition is on our right here. This book is the first archivally based book which broadly covers the Soviet home front. And it offers a lot of new material, both on state policies as well as on popular experiences. It includes conditions of daily life, rationing, Black markets, public health, propaganda, the labor system, and the evacuation and then liberation of the occupied territories. So in this short time, I'd like to survey some of the features of the Soviet home front that made it unique. And I think the two most important of these are, first, the extent of mass mobilization and control by the state in every realm, from control of the food supply to evacuation of the industrial base in the West to the East, to the mass conscription of all able-bodied citizens for work. And in this sense, I think it relates a little bit to what Michelle was talking about with women. And second, the degree of sacrifice that was required from all citizens, men, women, peasants, workers, officials, the old and the young, from every nationality, ethnicity, and republic. In short, I think what we see on the Soviet home front is what's known as total war. Now, this phrase has come to include things like mass conscription, economic mobilization and reorientation of the economy, blurred lines between civilians and combatants, sieges, scorched earth, and totalizing state control, as well as collective punishment of civilians, slave or unfree labor, and mass murder by occupying powers. By every measure that I just listed, the Soviet Union was involved in a total war. The vast majority of German divisions, and this is something that I think often gets lost for us in the West, were actually arrayed against the Red Army on the Eastern Front, which stretched over 1,500 miles. And it was here that the back of the Wehrmacht was broken. Leningrad was surrounded in the longest running siege in modern history, in which almost 1 million people starved to death. The German army visited mass destruction on the people that were trapped under occupation. About 1/3 of the 6 million Jews that were murdered in the Holocaust were killed by the Nazis or their allies on Soviet soil. And a staggering 26 to 27 million Soviet citizens, both civilian and soldier, including millions of Soviet POWs, died in the war. So the figures are huge. The heavy bombardment of Soviet cities, as well as partisan warfare, the voluntary militias that fought alongside the Red Army to defend the cities, all of these things dissolved the line between civilian and soldier. In Fortress Dark and Stern, we show that the Soviet Union achieved a mobilization of resources, including food, raw material and production resources, and labor, that was so total that the home front was actually close to collapse by the end of the war. So the nation was stretched to the breaking point. But what is a breaking point? What does that actually mean in practice? Can we go to slide 2? So unlike some combatant countries, in the Soviet Union, the home front and the military front were closely connected, shrinking and expanding in tandem with the occupation and the liberation of Soviet territory. After the invasion in June, the Red Army falls back in a kind of chaotic retreat. And by late fall, Byelorussia, most of Ukraine, large parts of Russia were under German occupation, and the Germans were actually within striking distance of Moscow. Now, most of the country's industry, including its mines and steel plants, along with 40% of its pre-war population, was concentrated in the West, in those areas that were soon to be occupied by the Nazis. Within 2 days of the invasion, the government created a new body. It was called the Soviet for Evacuation, and its aim was to rescue machinery, people, grain, food, and cultural treasures that were under immediate threat. Over the coming months, as the Red Army retreated back toward the Volga, the Soviet for Evacuation assumed a massive task. And by December of 1941, it had evacuated about 17 million people, which was about 22% of the population, and about 37% of the pre-war value of industry, far to the south and east, where the factories were then rebuilt and they resumed production beyond the reach of German bombers. Now, the evacuation of the industrial base was an absolutely audacious feat. It was unprecedented in the history of warfare. It required great organizational coordination by the state, the railways, and industry, and also enormous courage by the workers who often took apart, packed, and then loaded the factories onto railway cars. And we see here a woman railway worker directing evacuated loads along the lines. And they did this under bombardment and sometimes days or even hours before the German army marched in. So if we look at the photo, I think we can see some of that grim courage exhaustion, determination on the face of this worker as she is directing these loads out. Now, the relocation of the industrial base had huge consequences, and one of the most pressing was labor. The eastern part of the country was sparsely populated, and as skilled and able-bodied workers headed to the front, residents of the East and evacuees alone could not fill the gap. So in response, the Soviet state created a wartime labor system that was also unique among the combatant nations and actually unprecedented in its own history. It created a body called the Committee to Enumerate and Distribute the Labor Force. And this committee was charged with assessing the number of available workers in every locality throughout the entire Soviet Union, and then mobilizing them to staff industrial enterprises that were in need of labor. Over the course of the war, the state mobilized almost 15 million free workers for either permanent or temporary work. People left their homes and families, and they traveled hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles east to live in barracks and work under very punishing conditions in distant factories, mines, peat bogs, and on construction sites. Like the Red Army, the newly mobilized labor force was created from more than 50 different national and ethnic groups. Labor mobilization was analogous to the military draft. If you received a labor mobilization order, it was a criminal offense to disobey it. So those orders had to be obeyed. The system worked in the following way. The industrial commissariats sent requests for set numbers of workers for specific mines, factories, or work sites to the State Committee on Defense, which was the highest wartime body in the country. The State Committee on Defense then in turn sent the approved requests to the committee and to the Commissariat of Defense, which then issued orders to provincial and republic level Soviets to round up the required number of people. So a single levy could involve anywhere from 500 to 350,000 people. And every province and republic was subjected to repeated levies through each year. So next slide. As we can see from this very young worker above, who is actually standing on a wooden crate in order to reach the machine that he's working on, young teenagers, women, and the elderly made up a significant portion of the labor force. Now, by 1943, the localities were no longer able to meet the demands for workers. There were literally no people left in the towns who weren't working, and the collective farms were so depleted that they could not give up any more people without hurting their ability to produce the food that the country needed. As a result, the rural areas were increasingly sending elderly, ill, and unfit people to fill the unending demands for labor. The next slide. So here, what we're looking at is the result of the slogan, all for the front. Motorized vehicles, tractors, trucks, horses had all been commandeered for the army. And here we have a group of collective farm workers. We see 4 women, 2 men, who are literally plowing with human labor power. They're using the soja, or the wooden plow, which was not much different from how people plowed in the medieval period. By early 1944, the mobilization system was breaking down. Local Soviets were failing to meet the mobilization orders on time or with the requested number of people. and everyone was working somewhere. Industry's insatiable demand for labor was actually threatening the ability to produce food in the countryside. So as people were mobilized to work far from home, the workplace assumed the tasks that are normally performed by women in the home for free. Home life virtually disappeared. Workers slept in barracks, they ate in workplace canteens, and they used workplace daycare centers. Everyone suffered from an almost total dearth of consumer goods. Soap, clothing, shoes, bedding, needles, thread, building materials, and fuel disappeared. Public baths and streetcars shut down for lack of fuel. People trudged long distances to work in freezing weather. Barracks, homes, and workplaces were often not heated. Workers slept on bare planks in freezing barracks. People dressed in rags, and they suffered terrible skin infections for lack of soap. The slogan, "All for the front," became a literal and painful reality. Now, through 1941, as the Germans occupied more territory, the sources of grain and food contracted, and the government quickly established a ration system according to a rough hierarchy, with defense workers at the top. Now, we know that many countries had rationing, especially of meat, butter, and other items. But we also know that in those countries, there was also commercial sale of food. So you could buy food in addition to the food that was rationed. In the Soviet Union, there was no commercial sale in retail stores without a ration card. And although rations constituted the bulk of what people consumed, they were not sufficient to meet people's basic caloric needs. So despite efforts to create food sources outside of the central stocks of the ration system, by 1943, people were dying of starvation in the industrial towns. Slide 5. Now, this image, I think, can help us to envision the meaning of total war and also the breaking point. So what we see here is we're looking at typical frontline soldiers in uniforms, wearing a helmet, boots, carrying a gun, ammunition, a blanket, a shovel, and other basic equipment. These soldiers go into battle supported by tanks, planes, and other armaments. Now, if we trace the supply lines back thousands of miles from front to rear, to the armaments workers who manufactured this equipment, and then beyond them to those who produced the chemicals, the coal, and other materials that produced the armaments. And then we look at the workers who supported these workers in turn, who labored in the fields, the forests, and the peat bogs to feed, warm, and shelter them. What we see is behind every frontline soldier stretches a vast chain of invisible laborers who produce the soldier. Now, I want you to imagine a transfer of resources from rear to front that is so complete that the laborers who produced the soldier struggled to sustain their own lives. This was the home front in the Soviet Union during World War II.
Thank you, Wendy. It's a really powerful discussion of breaking points, but on one that made me think about the totalizing effect of war. So the way in which, all countries with different breaking points, but the war manages to push everybody towards something that's a different breaking point by its end. So absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much. Angela, your presentation's up. Let's hear from you about the Māori Home Front.
Yes, well, thank you. Hopefully you can all hear me. Thank you very much, Wendy, for that amazing presentation, and Michelle for yours as well. Thank you, Dan, for cheering, and thank you again for the invitation to be a part of this special session. It's a wonderful opportunity for me to hear from a range of different people who are working on home fronts as a relatively kind of new kind of a person in this area. Although I've looked at Second World War for the last decade or so, but largely in the Pacific. And what I'm talking about today is about a book that doesn't yet exist, unlike the other two. This one is coming out with Auckland University Press next year. It's called Te Hau Kāinga, meaning home place, the Māori Home Front during the Second World War. We also have a second book associated with this, which will be in Te Reo Māori, official language of New Zealand, and is a slightly different format and approach. But this is the English language book that I'll be talking about today. So during the Second World War, around 16,000 Māori, or about 14% of the total Māori population, enlisted for home and overseas service. And that's a significant number. We're talking about a Māori population of around 90,000 around the early 1940s, and a population that's largely young. About 57% of that population is aged under 20. So 14,000 is a kind of significant number in itself. Of those deployed overseas, around 3,600 served with the 28th Māori Battalion, a tribally organised unit in the 2nd New Zealand Expeditionary Force, a famous unit in New Zealand. These men left the country in 1940, fighting in the Greece, Crete, North African and Italian campaigns. And theirs is a very well-known story in New Zealand, but probably less well-known overseas. It's got numerous books, novels, television documentaries, exhibitions, and a whole museum kind of dedicated to their exploits now. As the most decorated of all the World War II New Zealand battalions of the 2nd NZEF, the 28th has justly earned a place within New Zealand's military history, as well as the public's imagination. And the map that you see there is the kind of tribal organisation, how the 28th was organised into 4 companies across tribal lines. So Aparana Ngata, the man you see in the middle here, a long-serving Māori politician, has been dubbed the father of the battalion. He argued that the military contribution of Māori should be organised as a distinct unit led by Māori officers, so that the wider public should be fully aware of the sacrifice that Māori might make for the nation. Now, Ngata defined this as the price of citizenship, and he wrote a small booklet in 1943 under that title. He said this was a cost worth paying for an improved Māori status within New Zealand society after the war, and as a means of nurturing an ongoing Māori identity and enhancing mana Māori, or Māori prestige. Now, accounts of Indigenous men's military service during the Second World War have attracted the attention of historians in New Zealand, Australia, Canada, United States, and the broader Pacific. In comparison, Indigenous experiences of the wartime home front in these countries is far less well known. Now, more broadly, Yasmin Khan has found the global historiography around the Second World War wanting when it comes to non-white peoples, particularly non-white women. And Dan Todman, along with Catriona Pinal, with the special issue did for War and Society, have argued for the need to kind of revise historical interpretations of the Second World War by moving away from the sole focus on the cause and course and consequences of the war itself, and to other kinds of mobilizations. Now, we argue that Indigenous home fronts offer a really important way forward, and we need more of that kind of work to happen. This is because, at least in the New Zealand case, military deployment forms just one component of the Māori Second World War experience, even though that front of military service was so far away from home. And that was recognised at the time by Māori politicians like Ngata and other leaders who defined war service very broadly. That was inclusive of home defence, participation in the women's auxiliaries, contributions to national agricultural and industrial production, and patriotic fundraising, all of those themes that Wendy and Michelle have touched on for the other home front stories. As a 1943 memo to the Māori recruitment and liaison officers who help support Māori going into the services, put it, and I quote, "The boys overseas expect us to maintain the home front." So we're quite interested in what that home front looks like and how that was experienced. So we see our book as contributing to a widening of what is traditionally understood as war service, at least in New Zealand scholarship. Another important aspect of the book is that it argues for a really close analysis of the wartime home front in order to understand the transition to peacetime in New Zealand. Often in New Zealand, the war is kind of a 1939 to 45 thing. We have no understanding of the 1940s as a decade, and we start the peacetime story from 1945 as if the war didn't exist or had a kind of part to play in that story at all. Typically, histories of post-war New Zealand, they start in 1945 and they should start in 1939 or 38. And the war's contributions to changes in these decades are regarded as self-evident, as something not in need of any explanation or in-depth kind of analysis. Historians in here regularly repeat the claim that the Second World War was transformative for Māori society. But as Melissa Matutina-Williams notes in the quote I've got on the screen, the war remains one of the most insidious and least understood changes in Māori society and history. And that's because we're talking about a story of colonisation in this country. And partly too because the war itself brought about wide-scale post-war urbanisation for Māori and major demographic, political and social transitions and disruptions that changes people's lives immeasurably across generations. So we think, this book is making a bit of a contribution to thinking about that transition between war and peacetime, what that looked like for communities. So what we've tried to do with the book is focus on how the Second World War shaped Māori society in the 1940s by looking at the way communities, civilians and their families were impacted by the wartime experience at home. We are trying to tell the story of the Second World War from places Māori lived, worked and raised their families, whether that's in marae or tribal centres, the role of the churches and faith and religion, which is so important in Māori society to contributing to understanding wartime experience, schooling, farms, rural and urban workplaces, because we don't have a kind of really good understanding of those elements of the Māori story during the Second World War. And we're trying to do that in a kind of national kind of broad overview as well. So another key theme that our book is trying to deal with is to kind of show that home front histories are not homogenous. And I think we've seen evidence of that in our presentations today. But they're often treated like this in our historiographies, particularly in New Zealand, because they focus on the nation. But when we look at Indigenous peoples and we take Indigenous focused accounts, then they decenter the nation completely. Instead, quite different political formations or mobilizations that Dan and Catriona have talked about come into prominence. For this story, we're talking about iwi or tribe, tribally organized approach to military service. We're talking about hapu, sub-tribal entities, but also whānau, family, which is a social unit but a political entity as well. And those are all really important components for thinking about how the nation doesn't necessarily work as a useful kind of concept for thinking about war service and the home front itself. Certainly in discourses of the time and in the imagination of the general public since, the war was a unifying factor. In a time of great need and anxiety, communities, the nation, even the empire all pulled together in common pursuit of victory. And this included Māori who enlisted for military service. They were not conscripted. They also entered into essential war industries in great numbers. They supplied agricultural produce for the country and its allies, and they participated immensely in patriotic fundraising activities. So there's no doubt that the Māori contribution to the war effort was genuine, sustained, and immense, but it's set against a background of colonisation, and that shapes the ways in which Māori see the war as a sacrifice for all communities. So while the Māori Home Front experience shares aspects of the national story, it also has important distinctive features that distinguish it from that of Pākehā or non-Māori New Zealanders. Most significantly, Māori leaders explicitly linked war service to political claims, not unlike Indigenous peoples elsewhere who perceived involvement in the Second World War as a force for decolonisation and self-determination movements in the post-war decades. And Lynn Poyer's recent book on this question is really useful and kind of maps it in a kind of global sense. But this is often asserted, but not explored in detail in our historiography. So we argue if military service overseas and experiences at home are intimately connected, they need to be analysed together rather than separately. And that's the case particularly for Indigenous peoples, particularly when war service and home front sacrifices were explicitly linked to kind of anticipated post-war political and economic transformation in rights and status. And this is reflected, particularly this idea of self-determination and autonomy in things like the Māori War Effort Organisation, established in 1942, that lasted for the remainder of the war. This was a tribally organised but state-supported entity where tribal committees worked in their local communities alongside executive committees and a kind of larger group of Māori political figures to encourage recruitment into the services, but also for home front support in the agricultural and industrial front as well. This was a really successful entity, one that Māori hoped would be retained after the war, but wasn't. What happened is a return to assimilation policy. So for the war, there's a kind of suspension of assimilation to allow kind of for a moment of kind of self-determination and autonomy, one that was really, really successful in the terms of the MWEO. I know I'm running out of time, so I'll get to the point of the end. So that's my other point. Colonisation, self-determination and political rights are really important. And when it comes to the nation, even in the context of the MWO, which is state-supported, there are always conflicts and contestation over how recruitment was to be done and achieved. Now, the MWO was, there were 398 tribal committees by 1943. About 10 people per committee. Every single person was a volunteer. They weren't paid to do this work. Luke Rangi here gives you an example of the contestation that comes out of the MWO. What I love is the MWO is state-sponsored and supported, but it's a wonderful source of political determination, autonomy, and another kind of mobilisation that serves the aspirations of Māori during the Second World War. And the other thing that I think is really important, which I'll finish on, is that we often see the war as something that's 1939 to 1945, and it's taken out of the context of a larger time period. And I think that's problematic for how we think about continuities over time, particularly within an Indigenous context. We often see the home front as a united effort, but for Māori, it wasn't always the case. Right through the Second World War, Māori are constantly contesting over historical injustices. And here's an example of a petition from 1942 that goes through into 43 that relates to a historical injustice. So if we take the war out, 39 to 45, we lose a sense of that continuity, and we don't get to see Indigenous peoples situated within this longer legacy of contestation, and we miss seeing how the war as a part of that story of contestation and conflict around historical injustices as well. So thank you very much for your time. I have gone on a little bit too long, but hopefully we'll have some interesting questions and discussion.
Yeah, I'm sure we will, and that was great. I was smiling to myself about that wonderful letter and
great,
the pressure the war puts onto local elites. I was thinking of I got one from a county war agricultural committee in Yorkshire in 1942 with somebody saying almost exactly the same thing. No, I'm a volunteer, but I'm going to stop doing it because you keep forcing me to do too much. No, that was brilliant. Thank you very much. We've got 4 questions in. I'm going to take chair's privilege while I read through them and just ask all of you to think about one that maybe links your different papers together, and that's to think about the boundaries of home front and how that affects its utility as an analytical concept. So if I look at the historiography from the First World War, it seems to me a lot of that has moved towards thinking about the space between home and fighting front as being much more porous, and that in fact it's that porous space that might be the most important thing for understanding some of the dynamics of cultural mobilization. So I just wondered, in all these three cases, how porous is that space between the fighting front and the home front? How aware of are people? And that maybe feeds into the question I can see that David's asked about sort of awareness and reactions from those at on the fighting front. So, Michelle, let's hear from you first, and then I'll ask I'll bring the other panelists in.
Okay, thanks, Dan. It's such an interesting concept, and that's something I would like to explore more with regards to Scotland, looking at that kind of fluidity between home and fighting front. But I did find in my own study that for a lot of people it was surprisingly easy to forget about the fighting front. So there did seem to be a clear boundary. People often felt as if they weren't really at war, or maybe it was England's war, or maybe it was happening someplace else far away from us. So there was an ability to forget, to go on holiday, to do sort of, I guess, nice things. And so I would like to explore more those connections in future, but certainly within my own study, I did find that there was a clear sort of delineation there. Yeah.
You're on mute, Dan.
Only 3 years of being on blooming video calls. Lovely answer, Michelle. While I turn to Wendy, could you have a think about David's question in the Q&A box about how soldiers might have felt about it? Wendy, I wondered actually whether does home front have a meaning in this Soviet context? We are talking about as a society which is so involved in the war that it seems like they're all involved in the struggle.
Well, you can be involved in the struggle and still not actually be mobilized into the Red Army. So I would say, yes, there is a line, but the line is extremely porous. And, it's porous, I think, in some of the ways that I talked a little bit about. One is we've got, because of occupation, home front and front are literally right up against each other, and there's constant movement. So as the Red Army retreats, the German army moves in, the home front is shrinking in a sense. And then after Stalingrad, the home front is then expanding. So as it expands, as the Red Army begins marching west, you have now millions more people that are now incorporated into the ration rolls, for example, who are now mobilized for labor. And also you begin to have the whole project of reconstruction in areas that are completely devastated. So there's just the geographic aspect, but then there's also, I would say, the second thing is the mass mobilization aspect. And we saw a little bit of this, I think, with Michelle, but Michelle, I think you were talking about 500 women that got mobilized, and there was resistance to that. We're talking here about 15 million people are mobilized. So the scale, it's just a point at which you can't just say, oh, it's bigger. It's like this shades into something else, right? There was voluntary militia in all of the cities in which many of the workers joined. They were armed. It was called the Opolchania, and they fought alongside the Red Army in many, many cases. Stalingrad, was still occupied by people. And as they were fighting from literally floor to floor of these great factories, room to room of these houses, there were civilians in there that were also then carrying out all kinds of jobs for the army, including children who acted as runners. So the bombing, when you have a situation where you have bombing and you've got large numbers of people mobilized to do fire spotting on the roofs, I think, and to put out the incendiary devices, there too, you have people on schedules to do this. And a lot of times they're elderly people and they're trained to do it. It's like a form of almost a military activity. So I would say that in all of those things, we definitely see a blurring of lines.
Thanks, Wendy. Angela, what about in the case that you're looking at?
Well, yeah, I like to think of multiple home fronts in one location. I think when you think about Indigenous, one of the things that we've been trying to stress in our book is that, that Māori story, even within Māoridom, feels different. The home fronts change and shift depending on where people are located within the nation. the northern kind of population of New Zealand will look different to the east coast, to Stewart Island or Chatham Islands off the coast of New Zealand as well. So I think that even within a country, there are these kind of multiple levels of kind of home front, even though there's this sense of a shared experience of industrialization, things like that. I also think, as Wendy pointed out, scale matters. Scale and location matters. New Zealand's in the Pacific. We have a Pacific theatre that opens up that makes the war come very close in a very different way to how that's experienced in Russia, or what that looks like from Scotland. And also, I think too, for Māori, we have a lot of emphasis on the 28th as being a really important kind of unit. And there's a lot of kind of understanding of what the 28th is doing. There's a lot of pride in the 28th. You know, lots of letters home. We have politicians like Apirana Ngata who make sure that the name, the 28th, is always in the public mind as well. So that kind of the sense of what's happening overseas is still very pertinent. And the loss of life is something that brings people together in mourning, and keeps that kind of sense of the home front and the overseas front together, and tied together. But we also have Māori in other units of the 2nd New Zealand Expeditionary Force, in the Navy, and also in the Air Force as well. But these stories are less well understood, and I think there's some work to be done to think about what home front looks like in relation to those other units where Māori exist and are participating.
Oh, thank you. 3 great answers. Let's turn to some of the questions from the audience. Some lovely questions that have come in. Michelle, what about this issue that David Littlewood raises? So about so how are Scottish soldiers feeling about some of these divisions?
Yeah, that's such a good question, and I would love to know the answer to that. That's I've been trying to get funding for the last 2 years to do this exact project, because I'm intrigued to know what their response was to what was happening at home, and particularly if maybe protests or absenteeism at factories is affecting the production of munitions. How does that then affect those on the home front? On the fighting front. So the answer is, I don't know, but I would very much like to know the answer. So thanks for the question, David.
That's the best sort of question.
Yeah.
What about turning to Wendy Ugolini's question? So about you talked about this sort of discourse around Scottish mobile women. So to what extent is that about the way the Scottish nationalists frame that,
Wendy,
and about this being England's war?
Exactly. It's a very pertinent point that a lot of the MPs involved in that discussion in Parliament were from nationalist backgrounds or supporters of home rule, and had very, I guess, prominent ideas about Scotland and fighting against the Union and that sort of thing. So I think there was quite a lot of fomenting of that situation by nationalist MPs. Although it's also worth noting that there was, I guess, dissent expressed from a wide range of the public over that, in terms of whether it was the girls and their families, whether it was MPs, civic representatives, even Tom Johnson, the Secretary of State, although worth noting that he also has a nationalist background. So certainly the nationalists were quite heavily involved in some of these issues, and that is worth keeping in mind. Yeah.
Thank you. Angela, so we've got a question here from the grandchild of Lieutenant Colonel James Hanare, a commander of the Māori Battalion, about where they might find some research connected to the families of the Māori Battalion. So there's a way that's picking up some of what you were talking about before. So I wonder if you got an answer about where to look. I mean, you can say in our book if you like.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think for the men who served in New Zealand, the 28th Māori Battalion website is wonderful. It has it's a kind of more crowdsourced website where a lot of community members are putting out information. The man who was mentioned, James Henare, was a particularly significant figure who becomes a leading political figure in post-war New Zealand. So it's kind of a really relatively well-known person. But for those who are wanting to look at their war service, especially, I would encourage everyone to get in contact with the New Zealand Defence Force and ask for their military personnel file, because that is full of wonderful, wonderful material about where they served, the impact of the war on those men. And one of the things that I'm interested in at the moment that I'm starting to kind of work on is rehabilitation, both in terms of the economic rehabilitation of the men when they come home, but also the medical care. And the thing that is really important about the 28th Māori Battalion is that they had one of the highest wound rates of the 2nd New Zealand Expeditionary Force. But we have no research done really on the medical care and support that's provided for them. So I'm currently looking at kind of plastic surgery unit that was set up by the Army in New Zealand. So go to New Zealand Defence Force online, apply for their military record. As whānau members, you get it for free, and it will be sent to you for free as well. And those military personnel files tell you so much that maybe you didn't even really know about the story of these men, because so many came back and didn't really reveal a lot about what that experience was like for them overseas.
Okay, so we've got some great questions and too little time, I think, to answer them all. I'm going to give the panelists a choice. So pick either. So Jonathan Fennell's asked a question about given the extent of friction on all three home fronts, why didn't the Scottish, Soviet, or Maori home fronts break? So you can help Jonathan with his project of writing a global history of the war by giving him some information if you like. Or you could have a look at let's have a look at James Kimball's question. So that's about thinking about chronologies of the home front. So I think that really picks up on one of the things you were saying, Angela, about what are the different ways we might think about chronology, both within the war and beyond its boundaries. And that might bring us into wider points. For example, Hugh Davies one here for Wendy Goldman about thinking about the impact of bigger historiographical debates inside and outside the Soviet Union. That's a separate seminar, I reckon. So a minute each. Pick one and tell me what you think. Michelle.
You're on mute.
Sorry, I was just making a note. I've accidentally moved one of the questions to the other box. So did you ask me to pick a question and answer it? I liked Jonathan's question about the friction on the home fronts. And again, I think this is an area worth exploring further. As Angela's pointed out, we tend to assume that home fronts are homogenous, and actually there's so much going on across any home front, whether it's concepts of sort of localized identity and that being stronger than national identity, or whether it's ethnic, or perhaps in the case of New Zealand, Indigenous identities. So I would be all in favour of a study looking at dissent across international home fronts and trying to understand what stops that from tipping over into a bigger situation. So good question, Jonathan, and I would like to see some answers to that question.
On the matter of why didn't home fronts break, I'm just going to be really quick. I mean, for Māori, you can support the state in the war effort, but you can also critique it at the same time. And I think that says something quite significant about the cultural kind of power of many of those Māori leaders in the communities themselves and the strength of those communities. It's fine to do both. And I think that means that you don't necessarily break as such. And on chronology, I'm a real fan of seeing the war as part of a longer trajectory, at least from the context of Indigenous history, but it's often kind of taken out of that context and treated separately. So our book is kind of seeking to kind of reshape that a little bit. People might ignore us completely, they probably will, but I just think that when you're dealing with Indigenous history, you have to deal with long trajectories of historical injustice and change. So you cannot take something like the war out. You can't slice it out completely because you miss so much of what's happening on the home front.
That's a really useful insight. Thank you so much. Wendy, let's close with you. So, I mean, I think in a way your presentation posed the question, why didn't the Soviet home front break? Do you want to pick up that, or do you want to talk about something else?
I would just say briefly that I think it's really important we define what we mean by break. Do we mean that there was dissent? Do we mean that there was revolution? I mean, in 1917, we have a home front that breaks, seriously breaks. So we just have to define that term. I think that what I tried to show was that the food supply and the labor mobilization system were two things that we were getting to the point there where it was impossible to continue to wage this war, because the civilian population there was nothing left basically to wring out of them. Now, a very interesting question comes from that. How is it that people were willing to assume that level of sacrifice? But I'm going to leave that one aside because that's a huge discussion. So let me just turn to Hugh Davis's question about historiography. A really, really interesting question. I would say that, first of all, in the West, I think our studies of the Soviet war effort have been enormously influenced by the Cold War. So in terms of teaching in the United States, we have feats like evacuation, for example, which you could argue, in fact, given that the Wehrmacht is defeated on the Eastern Front, you could argue that evacuation is the feat that wins the war. But most people don't even know anything about it. Very few people know anything about the Soviet participation, despite the fact that it was just so incredibly important. And then, of course, on the other side, on the side of the Soviet Union, and now I would say Russia as well, the war became, for many, many, many years, it was this victory that you could not discuss in any honest way. It was as if the narrative, at least during the Brezhnev period, was that the Soviet Union just kind of sailed from one success to another. And there was very, very little discussion of things that, have come up now that Don and I talk about in Fortress, for example, like starvation on the home front. So we were both are very, very interested in, first of all, that the book was even published in Russian, because I think it discusses many, many what we might consider to be less savory aspects of life and of the difficulties and of the sacrifices. But we really tried to do it in a way that a victory is something that's precious because it costs something. If a victory is easy, why is it particularly precious? And I think that what happened, in the Soviet case was that the victory just began to look as if you couldn't discuss any of the sacrifices or the difficulties in depth. So it just began to look as if, well, it was just some sort of set of heroic, feats that were linked. So very different ways, I think, of dealing with, the war. Now in Russia, of course, anything that besmirches the army in any way is actually illegal, and you can go to prison for it. So I think this is going to put an enormous dampener on genuine research. It's very hard to do serious research, I think, under that kind of edict. So I think that's really problematic. And let me just end by saying, and this is something I think that unites all of our talks. One of the big things that I think is important to do for the Soviet home front, but it seems like it's also being done in other cases as well, is the Soviet Union was a multinational country. And we have, what was the participation like for Central Asians? What was it like for peoples in the North? What was it like for peoples in the borderlands? I mean, these are all really, really different experiences. And I think that looking at that, and also looking at the extreme intensification of national and ethnic tension during the war, in part because of the extreme mobility of the population and the situation in which people were often forced so for example, every family in the East who had a domicile was forced to take in evacuees who frequently came from really different places. The barracks were filled with people from very different cultures, different foodways, different religions, different attitudes. I mean, what happens when you mingle up people like this? And you don't always get a story of unity and light. You know, you get frequently difficulties are expressed through prejudice, discrimination, and national hatred. And that too is something I think that's really worth investigating in all of its different ways.
Thank you, Wendy. I think it's worth ending with that image of the war as a sort of colossal cement mixer, churning people about, bringing them into new combinations, not always ones that will stick together. So thank you so much for the opportunity to chair this, Michelle. It's been absolutely wonderful. It's just been a lovely opportunity to think about the Second World War for an hour, which doesn't sound like a nice thing to do, but it's put me into my historical happy place. I've learned a lot. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, audience, for some really good questions. I'm sorry if we didn't have time to get to your question. I am sure that if you felt strongly enough about it and you wanted to email any of our panelists, they'd be happy to give you a response. Let me thank our tech support as well, and say goodbye, good evening, good morning. Have a great rest of the day, great rest of the week, and let's catch up about the Second World War soon. Bye-bye.